Welcome to the Sociable Dog Pod, the podcast for anyone who wants to know more about the extraordinary relationship we have with our dogs and why we don't always understand each other. We'll be digging into the roots of dog behaviour so we can get to know our best friends better and make our lives with them a little richer. We'll be busting some of those sticky myths about why they do what they do, exploring how they learn and trying to interpret their language. We'll talk science, we'll share stories, have some laughs and make some interesting discoveries all along the way. I'm Si Wooler and I've been working with dogs and their humans for more than 15 years. So let's talk dogs.
This week we're going to be talking about learning by consequences and making training really stick. Learning by consequences is something you've mentioned before quite a few times, but we're going to drill a bit more down into this. So first off, do a quick recap of what learning by consequences is all about and what it means teaching obedience behaviours.
Yes, and I have to say that we are currently doing this with a little cockapoo playing bally around our feet. So if there's noises off, that's why we've got #RipleyDog that you can hold responsible for that. But we have talked quite a bit about the difference between learning by consequences and learning by association, with the emphasis as far as conversation has been concerned around learning by association. So we haven't really done a great deal of descriptive work on what learning by consequences is. But essentially, it's this. There are two ways that dogs learn. They learn by association. So they learn one thing predicts another, which is how we've been dealing with fear and aggression and behaviour problems in previous podcasts. So they don't have influence over that, but they do learn the connections between things and they have emotional responses to them. Learning by consequences is where a dog can do something in order to influence what happens next. For example, when you're teaching sit, if they get paid for sit, they're going to do sit again in the future and they're going to do more of it and they're going to get more efficient at it because that's what gets paid. You can have, absolutely, both things happening at the same time. In fact, they always do. Essentially, you get an emotional byproduct to learning by consequences or obedience behaviours, and you get superstitious consequential learning, so operant conditioning behaviours. You get superstitious versions of that as well in relation. So you can get dogs who do work for pay, develop emotional responses, and dogs that develop emotional responses because of the connections they make tend to adopt superstitious behaviours as a result.
Okay. So learning by consequences is, let's say, the big overarching principle of how dogs learn obedience behaviours. But then there are different methods we can use to teach them, aren't there?
Yes, there are some different methods. The ones, there are two in essence. There's lure and reward, and there's shaping. And lure and reward is where you, as the title suggests, you lure a dog into a position first, and then you start to go through a systematic process of teaching them what that behaviour is until you get to the point where they're doing it to a verbal command. Shaping is where you pay for an approximation of the behaviour that you want, and you generally mark that because it tends to be spontaneous. It's most commonly done with clickers, so you tend to mark it with a clicker in order to progress that behaviour, and you gradually see the dog adopt behaviour that's closer to the one that you ultimately want.
Okay. Which is better, or both equally good?
Neither. There's a long debate. There has been a long debate around this, and all of the research that's been done, and there hasn't been a great deal, it has to be said, that's compared the two approaches. But that has been done have concluded that there is no difference. They are both equally efficient in reality, or as near as damn it is to swearing.
Okay, but shaping tends to be used particularly with things that are quite complex, like assistance dogs.
Yes, I think it's most usefully used. I mean, I'm a lure and reward trainer. I'm quite willing to admit that. For the sake of transparency, I have a bias. Right? My bias is towards lure and reward. Some people prefer clicker training and shaping for across the board behavior training. So across the board obedience behaviors, they'll go for clicker training every time. I think it's most useful when what you need to do is capture a fleeting moment's behavior. And it's easier to do that with a very sharp, sudden percussive sound than it is with a verbal yes or good. So you want to capture that very, very fleeting moment. And when they repeat it, you want to capture it again so that they learn that that's definitely the behavior that was getting paid, that one particular thing. I think it works really well for retrieves. So there's an excellent training program for doing retrieves using clicker training. And as you say, service dogs. So where dogs might be wanting, they might be needed to do something like empty a washing machine or go and collect something for their person and bring it back to them and potentially do some quite complex moves, then I think clicker training has real advantage because you do need to capture an approximation to begin with. You might have to start with the dog in the kitchen and click and treat for every time the dog accidentally turns their head towards the washing machine. And then over time, the dog's going to learn, and it's about looking at the washing machine that is getting the click, and we'll start to move closer towards the washing machine in order to try and elicit the payment faster. So I think that it's got lots of... You can still train that with lure and reward, by the way, because you could lure the dog to the washing machine. You could start to pay for nudges on the washing machine, which is what you'll get. But I think in terms of being able to specify which area of the washing machine you want them to touch and so on and so forth. Using the washing machine may not be the best example, but you get my point, right? That you're needing to get towards a very specific behaviour that isn't necessarily natural to them. Natural inverted commas.
It's important to say, though, that all the clicker does is to mark a moment and say a reward is coming. The clicker is not the command. People sometimes get a bit confused, don't they?
They do. And you can sometimes see people clicking away in an effort to get the dog to do something. And that's the wrong way round. Like the clicker is something called a secondary reinforcer or a secondary rewarder. So the primary reinforcement is the food. The secondary reinforcement is the thing that tells you the food is coming. And that might be the good or yes or good boy or good girl in verbal commands. And that fills the gap between the thing that you actually wanted them to do and the payment. And that's all the clicker does. It says, here it comes. If it doesn't do that, then the clicker has no value because it doesn't predict anything. So it has to come after the behavior, and it always means food. So it is not a reinforcer in itself. It has to mean that food is coming.
Okay. So far, so good doggish. Why do people sometimes struggle with their training? They think they've taught a downstay or a recall, and then somehow it all seems to fall apart.
It's usually less about the behaviour falling apart or the training falling apart than it is about setting criteria and setting too high an expectation of your dog. And by that I mean, let's take, for example, the recall. If you're getting a good recall at home and you've got a tremendous recall from one side of the garden into the kitchen through the house, then your expectation might be that you're going to be able to take that out in the world because he's so responsive to you in the garden. They'll be able to do that out on a walk. And the reality is that you've missed out an awful lot of steps between recall in the garden where everything's boring and old news and 200 yards on the plain with deer and squirrels running around in trees. So your expectation is too high for success, but equally you haven't filled the gap between those two criteria steps. Not only are squirrels what we call competing motivators, but they are also moving targets at variable distances from you. Important to remember that the closer to the target your dog is and the further away from you, the harder it is for them to achieve the recall for you. And they're not being bloody-minded or stubborn. They just haven't learned that. So work to an incremental plan is the first tip, and set realistic criteria steps is the second. Practice, practice, practice is the brutal truth of it. Train in different places at different times, I think, is another good tip, because as we've said before, dogs don't generalize terribly well. They have to learn how to do that. It's a skill for them. They learn specifics really well, but understanding that they have to do what's being asked of them in different places at different times for different people, that's a different story. Dogs have a limited number of pounds, behavioural pounds, to spend with you as well. So it might just be that they're tired or bored or indifferent to the treat you've got on offer. So change it up, make it more interesting, increase the ante, if you like, and see whether or not that gets you a bit more training time.
You started to talk there about a really efficient method of training. Tell us more.
Yeah, well, the technique that I use and the technique that I teach is something called push drop stick. This is something that I learned from Jean Donaldson at the Academy for Dog Trainers. And it involves a very deliberate system of training using counting. So you get your dog in position and you decide what it is you want to train. So you're going to train a sit, let's say, for argument's sake. You lure the dog over the head with the treat. What tends to happen with animals is that if you put food in front of them, they'll follow the food. Their head follows the food. So if you bring the food over the back of their head, most dogs will lean backwards to watch the treat and put their bum on the floor in order to carry on watching the treat. And as soon as their bum's on the floor, you pay them. Then you do that for 5 reps. So if you think of this like you would if you were going to the gym, doing circuit training in the gym, you do that for 5 reps. And then you do a hand signal that looks very similar to the lure, but without the food in your hand. And with sit, that typically looks like your hand with the back of your hand coming over the dog's head and then coming back towards your face. And they tend to go down on their bums when they see that, because once it's coming over their heads, they're already doing the thing that they did before. You do that for 5 reps. And you're counting how many times they win. So do they go down into a sit all 5 times? Or do they go down 4 times, 3 times, 2 times, 1 time? No times. If they go down no times, or 1 or 2 times, then you drop to the previous stage. Now, if there wasn't a previous stage, you go somewhere halfway between nothing and the thing that you did. That can sometimes be, say, for example, if they don't go on the lure, then you can just go for a slight dip of the back end to begin with. If they fail repeatedly on the big hand signal, you can tuck the food in your thumb, behind your thumb on your hand, and that often does the trick. So 0, 1 and 2, you drop. 3, which is in the middle, you stick. So you repeat your 5 reps. And 4 and 5, you push to the next level. And the next level would be a smaller hand signal. And then after the smaller hand signal, I tend to put in another hand signal, depending on how well the dog's done. And then you count again. On each stage, you count. Did he get more right than wrong? Or in the middle? And in the middle, you stick. More right than wrong, you push. Fewer right than wrong, you drop. And at that point, because here's the thing, that's when you put in, when you've gone through all of that, you've got all the way to your small hand signal, and your dog is rocking it. Through that process, they've achieved 4 or 5 out of 5 for a small hand signal. Then you put in a verbal command. You don't do it at the beginning. You don't do it anywhere but the end. There are some behaviours where it's beneficial to put the verbal cue in quite early, like leave it, for example. I would often put the cue in quite early. Dogs don't learn verbal commands nearly as easily as they do visual ones. Don't put the verbal in until the end. And then you abandon your 5 count and you just go for as many as you need until the dog is reliably beating you to the verbal command. So what you do is you say the command, sit, And then 1 second later, you give the small hand signal, and they'll sit on the hand signal and get paid. And you repeat. And at some point, they're going to start to go before your hand signal, after you say sit and before you give the hand signal. And at that point, you start to count how many times they beat you to it. And when they're beating you to it 20, 25 times, then you get rid of the hand signal and you just go for the verbal cue. And if they go on the verbal, you pay them. And if you need a hand signal to persuade them, they get a jolly well done, good boy, good girl, but they don't get paid. So they only get paid for the verbal command. That's the answer to the question.
Basically, all of this counting before you move on is making sure that you are training at their speed of learning. So if they haven't learnt it, you either do it again or you go back. You're basically matching your training to their speed of understanding.
Yes, but it's important to bear in mind that your pace counts. So the speed that you train doesn't change. You don't slow things down because they're slower. You maintain a high rate, if you like. So just in the same way that you would in the gym, you're aiming for a certain rate of reinforcement is how we term it. You're looking for a rate of reinforcement that's high, as high as 12 or 14 in a minute. And that doesn't sound much, but try and achieve it because you've got to reset the dog and all of that sort of thing. So you're aiming for a high return, but you're counting in order to be sure that the dog is understanding now what they want. It also gives you a system, which means you don't get frustrated because you're just working the system. You don't think of it in terms of the dog being difficult or awkward or
stupid
or rambunctious or whatever you want to call it. All you're doing is counting and you will make progress. You're just working the system. Of course, there's more to it. There's going to be, what do you do if they don't move? How long do you give them before you declare a fail instead of a win? When do you use a split, which is something between the step that you're on and the next step? So there's lots of nuance, but you didn't expect me to give away the whole store now, did you?
Anything else that might be helpful in life generally? You're a great lover of kit. Never knowingly undertect or underspec you. But in training, less so. Are there some bits of kit that help with training?
Yeah, I do love kit. I have to admit, as we sit here, it's surrounded by tech. I do love kit. But yes, there are some things that over time I've learned help me in my job. And I have to say that anything that we suggest here is just that. It's a suggestion. It's our preference. We're not sponsored by anybody, and others may find different bits of equipment useful. But these are the ones that we've come across in time. The first thing I would say is leads. Pick a good lead. I would say it wants to be no shorter than 6 feet and preferably 8 feet. The ones I really like are the training leads that have a variety of different rings that you can clip the clip onto, and there are clips at both ends, so you can build handles and so on, or shorten the lead if you want to, or put one end on a collar and one end on a harness, so on and so forth. Some of them even have a little grab handle right in the center, which means that if you double up or you shorten the lead, you've got an actual handle to hang on to, which is quite neat. Long lines. Great, absolutely great. I tend to buy more, for larger dogs, I have lunge reins. So I use horse reins rather than dog leads because the long lines that you buy for dogs tend to be a bit thin and spindly. And so the stronger and thicker ones I quite like for the big dogs. They come in a variety of lengths. You can get them as short as 5 meters and you can get them as long as, I think, 30 meters. They're absolutely great for recall training. They're fantastic for getting out in the wild and confronting other dogs if you've got a dog that needs some practice with that. And I caveat that with you need to understand what the motivation behind any reactive behaviour is, for example, so that you can be well informed about whether you approach or not and how you approach. Treat pouches, yes, love them. We use Dog Gone Good, which is never easy to say, but you can find those on Amazon now. They're American. They were quite difficult to find at one time, but they're square and they sit open really well. And you can just conveniently put a small freezer bag inside. There are some trainers who cannot abide the idea of putting a plastic bag in a treat pouch, but I'm kind of okay with it because I use a lot of wet food like chicken and ham and so on and so forth, Frankfurter and cheese and yummies like that, right? So not having to wash your bag out every time is pretty good. The other suggestion that I could have for a treat pouch, and this would definitely need a bag inside as well, is a mountaineering chalk bag. The guys that go up mountains, mad as they may be, have bags that hang by their side that are full of chalk, and they put their hands in to put chalk on so they get a better grip on the mountain. They stay open almost all the time, and they just swing off your belt, off a clip on your belt. So if you don't find a treat pouch that suits you, you could try that.
Halties, head collars, any of those sorts of things?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Now, Halties are really good. I like them. I think they're really good for big dogs that are powerful and strong and that you're struggling to control while you're training the process of, for example, not pulling on lead. They come in a variety of makes, models, sizes and colours, but you must train your dog to like wearing it first. That's the important thing. And at some point, I've been promising a video on how to do that for a long time, and I will make that video. But you must train your dog to like wearing it. Tolerating it isn't enough. The one we like is called a Dogmatic, and I don't know whether that's available anywhere else other than the UK, but they are great. We love them. I'm less keen on this, on the idea of this sort of figure of eight. You use a slip lead into a figure of eight. I'm less keen about that because I think there's risk that becomes aversive.
Since you've gone there, I think we would absolutely say nothing aversive. No bit of kit that causes pain or fear.
No. We are a force-free positive reinforcement company. We don't want people to train through fear or pain. We don't want dogs learning that they need to do things in order to avoid or escape unpleasant consequences. We don't want that to be the way that people live with their dogs. And we don't want the unintended consequence of that kind of training, which is that dogs develop negative emotional responses to stimuli. And that could be you. And then you've got a much bigger problem because you might have at one time had a dog that was enthusiastic about meeting people and too enthusiastic for you, and so you needed to tone that down. But if you use aversive methods to train that, the risk is that the dog is going to start to dislike people because people predict bad outcomes for them. Now you've got a much bigger problem. You've got a dog that doesn't like people rather than a dog that really, 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 really did like them. So we will do absolutely anything to persuade people that that's not the way to go with dog training.
That's learning by consequences. Learning by consequences is how dogs learn obedience behaviours. Our job is to teach them that doing things for us gets big reward, but doing things we don't want means they lose out on big rewards. We don't need to hurt them. We don't need to scare them. We're just basically teaching them the rules of good commerce when it comes to behaviour. It's a trade.
As far as learning by consequences is concerned, we are simply trading what we've got for what they will give us. The most efficient way for doing that is, the beauty of it is, you don't need aversive techniques. You don't need to say, watch out because otherwise this thing's going to happen and you don't want that to happen again. You don't need that. All you need to do is remove the opportunity for reward. They are all about getting paid. They're about emotional stuff as well, particularly with their families, right, with their people. That's why I do like to use family vocabulary when I talk about dogs, because they are family and they make a connection with us that is family. If you have any subjects that you would like us to cover on the Social for Dog podcast, let us know either in the comments or on our Twitter account or by email to simon@socialfordog.com. See you next time.